It's that time of year again, well, it's the end of the year again, and that means it's time for me to go over my thoughts on all the games I played in 2023. This year I've done something different. I coincidentally discovered the website Backlogged, where I've been logging every game I've played and bought this year, and have been giving them reviews after beating them. I'll put a link to my profile in the description if you want to read those. My star ratings for each game might seem lenient, but when I rate something 5 stars, I don't mean it's literally flawless, I mean that its flaws aren't major enough to impact my enjoyment. So, my games of 2023, or as I like to call it, the year of strategy games. Seriously, the fact that not only Engage, but also Reboot Camp got nominated for Best Strategy at the Game Awards this year, that makes me so happy. Speaking of which, those were the first 2 games I beat this year, and I have full playthroughs of both on my channel, so I'll be a little brief in these sections. Engage, I personally gave 5 stars, but looking at some comments, I've noticed something interesting about my opinions. They're actually not that different to the opinions of many other people. The flaws I see in the game are kinda similar to the ones others have, namely some parts of the story and the third act falling off. The issue is that those flaws didn't bother me nearly as much as they did for other people, because the gameplay was so mind-blowingly good, literally the best strategy gameplay I have experienced in decades, that yeah, that's enough for me. Engage brought back everything I love about playing Fire Emblem. And the reason why I, for lack of a better word, stan this game so hard, is I desperately want intelligent systems to keep it that way. I've realized lately that I honestly do not care what tone they go for in the next Fire Emblem story. It could be as dark as Three Houses, and I wouldn't mind as long as the gameplay is just as good or even better than Engage. Though I would prefer no more route splits, I just think they're a detriment to both gameplay and writing in the long term. Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp, I gave a 4.5 out of 10. The -half a star is just because these games are really good and they are great remakes, but they don't do much more than the originals already did. Especially since their main new edition is online play, and I found out that's limited to friend codes only. But Advance Wars 1 and 2 are really good games, and I'm glad more people are discovering that fact now. And the cartoon graphics of the power animations, the voice acting, and the amazing soundtrack enhance the experience a lot more than I expected them to. WayForward did a really good job. One thing I have noticed in my personal playthrough is I actually like Advance Wars 2's campaign less than I used to. Its advantages are a better story, more playable characters, and letting you actually deploy units and capture properties in more maps, but now that I've actually played the first game, I've really started to appreciate its focus on shorter, tightly designed maps, each of them being more of a strategic puzzle. Both are great games, but I've started to like one a lot more than I used to.
Alright, keep up!
The first game I beat this year that I did not cover on the channel is Xenoblade Chronicles 3 Future Redeemed, and yes, I am treating this as its own game, it kind of is. I ultimately give this game 4 stars. Future Redeemed succeeds at being both more of what you love in Xenoblade 3, while also being its own unique experience. There's no class system from the main game, instead you're stuck with a fixed party, but all 6 of them are great characters, and mostly work well in gameplay, I'll get to that later. And while there's some of the same exploration mechanics, my favourite thing about this DLC is the way that the bonding point system, no relation to the system from the Trails games, seamlessly integrates exploration into character building. I cannot believe it's taken the Xenoblade series this long to do something like this, because it's a perfect fit for the franchise. Basically, as you uncover landmarks, gather collectibles, and achieve side objectives in each location, you're rewarded with points you can spend to learn new arts on characters or enhance their existing arts. What's also great is the community system from Torna the Golden Country is back in this DLC, but it's gone through one massive improvement. It's optional. This means you get all the benefits of getting to know the NPCs of the region more as you complete quests for them, with none of Torna's issue of, you must do this much side quests to pass. There's a decent variety and size of areas to explore. Overall, it didn't feel as long as Torna the Golden Country, but it might be comparable if you cut out the forced side questing of Torna. Now on to the party and gameplay. While most of them are great, we're still running into the issue where tanks are just not that good. Nicole is merely okay, and Shulk is sadly the worst member of the party by far, as he has a terrible time getting aggro, especially when Rex is around. Giga Chad that he is, Rex's damage output is so ridiculously bonkers that he's hogging the aggro almost all the time. I get this is meant to be a weakness to discourage spamming his attacks, but even then, the tanks just don't do their job properly, and honestly, I feel like the aggro system in Xenoblade itself is fundamentally flawed. Tank characters and classes need some kind of aggro multiplier on their damage. The only reason Ryan and Dunban were good at being tanks in the first game is they also happen to be some of the best damage dealers in the party. With how lacking defenders were in the main story, and with Shulk here, I really hope Monolith does something to overhaul the aggro system, because this is getting ridiculous. In regards to story, Future Redeemed ultimately wasn't as mind-blowing as I expected, but that doesn't mean it wasn't good. If anything, it was surprisingly low-key and wholesome in a refreshing way. The party all genuinely like and support each other. Rex and Shulk have some great bonding moments over being dads. A few characters who are implied to be descendants of people from Xenoblade 1 and 2, along with Rex having some moments that imply just how much he idolizes Zeke. In general, with how divided Xenoblade fans are with 1 versus 2, I was surprised at how well Future Redeemed balanced nostalgia for both games. But it's not just nostalgia. The new characters and plot aspects are great too. Matthew is sort of the lovable idiot trope, but he's also a genuinely wholesome character with a great family relationship with Niall. A snarks at him a lot, but it's very good-natured and clearly comes from a place of respect, and is generally a very empathetic and caring person for everyone in the group. The plot itself does resolve a few lingering threads from the base game, but in a way that was surprisingly simple. Without directly spoiling it, the answer to who the heck is Riku is a perfect encapsulation of this. My reaction to the reveal being, oh, that makes perfect sense and is way less convoluted than I expected. Now, I don't like comparing this to Torna the Golden Country all the time, but one thing I will say is that this story did not make me radically reevaluate anything in the main game the way Torna did. That's not a bad thing, but Torna did take Mithra and turn her from one of my most disliked characters into my favourite Xeno character of all time, so it's a bit of a tough act to follow. I know a lot of people expected that this would suddenly turn Zed into the best character ever, and I'm one of the rare people who didn't mind Zed. In fact, if anything, I probably like Alpha less as a villain, and that's a massive hot take. If you want to know more and have already played Xenoblade 3, go watch my thoughts on Xenoblade 3's story video. But all in all, I know I've used this word too much, but this is a nice, wholesome conclusion to the Klaus saga. while still leaving enough tantalizing threads for the future. You'll know what they are if you played it. I recommend it, but more because buying it feels less like you're buying DLC for Xenoblade 3, and more like you're buying a standalone Xenoblade 3.5. More like 2.5 chronologically, but you get the idea. It's its own mini Xenoblade game. And now the big one, The Legend of Heroes Trails to Azure. Hyped to high heaven by the fanbase for years, I was always terrified that if I played this, it would never live up to that hype. And now that I have, yeah, the fans were right, this is the peak of the series. Azure really is the best part of everything a Trails game should be. A great world to explore, a fun party to use in battle, excellent world building, and an amazing story with world-shattering events happening right before your eyes. But unlike most Trails games, the pacing is incredible. The story hits the ground running and never lets up, and I hesitate to name any moment that feels like padding. In fact, one of my few criticisms with the story is that its pacing moves a little too fast in the third act. But in terms of gameplay, this is my favourite Trails game in terms of its world design and exploration. All of Crossbell from Zero returns, plus more, and amazingly, you can revisit almost everywhere at almost any time. There are only 2 locations in the entire game that you can never return to, and one of them is the prologue. This means there's a lot of side content, like high-level monster chests, customizing your car, and fishing, that you can either knock out in one go, or spread out over the whole game. The battle system is mostly the same as the first game, with the addition of many more higher level spells, the Master Quartz system. If you played Cold Steel, this is actually where it originated, and the core party being expanded from 4 characters to 8, though that has one issue that I'll go into later. The main cast also goes through some incredible development, both the existing SSS and the new members, including some surprising sides to characters. I cannot praise Shinichiro Miki's performance as Randy enough. It's absolutely insane how well he nails both hilarious comedy and soul-crushing tragedy. On the subject of characters, this game often gets criticized for being where the bonding point and harem mechanic from the Cold Steel games originated, but actually playing it, it's really not that bad. I did follow a guide to unlock every final bonding event in one playthrough so I could judge them all for myself, and surprisingly, only 2 of the girls are explicitly romantic with Lloyd. You can make the case for some of the others, but it's far from everyone blatantly crushing on him. But even the characters outside of the party, both the NPCs and the villains, are great. Well, mostly, I'll get to that later. And there's some surprising callbacks and call forwards. For example, you might remember Kilika from the Sky games. Let's just say her arc went in a direction I was not expecting. A more political direction. And as a segue, one of the things I love about the writing in Azure is how it handles politics. And no, I don't mean crazy discourse. I mean that this game really nails the feeling of being in a small, quasi-independent state that happens to be sandwiched between 2 giant greedy superpowers. Speaking to both Osborne and Rocksmith at the West Zemuria Trade Conference, you can cut the tension in those scenes with a knife. It's one of the few times a JRPG has made me feel genuine fear in a non-combat situation. And I'm sure the excellent translation by the Geofront team enhances this. They did an amazing job with the written dialogue in this game. Now, I'm gonna get into some negatives, but first I just want to stress, everything that I don't mention in this section, assume that I loved it. This game is very, very good, but there are some flaws that I need to get off my chest. The first is, while the battle system and the party are generally decent, Unlike Zero, which balanced physical attacks and art quite well, in Azure, spellcasting is the way to go past the halfway point, especially on Nightmare, and the physical specialists in the party fall off pretty hard. And remember when I said I had a gripe about the party system? Well, I said you have 8 total party members by the end of the game, but you're only allowed to bring 6 with you at once. How the game handles this is, you need to choose 2 to leave behind at the base, and those 2 miss out on all experience you gain during battles, which means that if they miss out on bosses, they fall very far behind in levels. Not only do you have to trek all the way back to the base to swap these 2 in, but the core 4 SSS members, Lloyd, Tio, Ellie, and Randy, must be in your main party at all times, giving you only 2 free slots to work with. Of the 4 people who can fill those slots, one of them falls off hard after the early game, one of them is bar none the most broken party member in the game, and candidate for the most broken character in Trails history, one of them is incredibly iconic to the Crossbell arc and is a major character in future games, while still being amazing in battle, and one of them literally joins halfway through the final chapter with barely any time for you to actually use them. It's kind of a no-brainer which 2 people should fill your free slot. Which is sad because the other 2 have some very good dialogue if you bring them to the late game boss fights. Speaking of, that's my other nitpick. While I generally love Azure's story, my main complaint is how some of the villains were used. Being as vague as possible, since this story is best experienced for yourself, but one of the villains has a very, very interesting ideological motivation and some fascinating dialogue with the main heroes, and they're ultimately a pawn in the scheme of a far less interesting villain. I really wish those 2 would swap roles. And then there's probably my biggest Trails hot take. So, in the final chapter, you go through the Stargazer Tower dungeon and fight some bosses affiliated with Ouroboros. These bosses are completely irrelevant to what's going on in Crossbell. As it turns out later on in the Cold Steel series, they are far more relevant to the lore of Erebonia, making them a glorified sequel hook more than anything. The problem is the leader of this group of bosses is the most climactic, difficult, and iconic boss fight in Trails to Azure, and I feel like that's such a waste for basically a walking sequel hook. I wish that fight had gone to a more relevant character. This character even outright admits they have very little investment in what happens to Crossbell in their pre-boss fight dialogue. Speaking of Cold Steel, one of the biggest issues in that story arc is also present in Azure. Namely, some incidents that really should cause a lot of fatalities end with no people dying. It's not as bad in this game as it will be later, because Azure is not afraid to show people literally gunned down in droves in some scenes, which makes it all the more jarring when other incidents that happen later on miraculously have nobody dying. And there is a common pattern to where this is done. The culprit is usually somebody the game wants you to feel sympathy for later. But the Sky arc did such a great job of redeeming Richard and Ren despite their many on-screen casualties, so I'm not sure why this approach was necessary. But as much as I railed on about these things, I stress that all of them are nitpicks within an otherwise immaculate game. Trails to Azure is not only my favourite standard Trails game, I still have a soft spot for Sky the Third, but I fully admit it's very different to the rest of the series. But this might also be one of my new favourite JRPGs, it's seriously that good. I'm so glad Zero and Azure finally got localized, because every JRPG fan should play them, not just Trails fans. And now to jump out of order for the sake of a good segue. Speaking of games that finally got localized, I played the Live Alive remake this year, even though it came out last year. I was busy with other games at the time, but I really wanted to give this a shot because, for history, this is a Square Enix Super NES JRPG that originally came out in 1994, predating most of their iconic titles. It was also one of the first things legendary composer Yoko Shimomura composed for. And it shows, the soundtrack is phenomenal. But for some reason it was never localized, and so it became the Fire Emblem 4, Ace Attorney Investigations 2, or even Trails Crossbell of Square Enix. That holy grail Japan-only game that everyone tells you to play the fan translation of because they insist it's amazing. And when it got an official localization with a full remake, I was all too keen to support it. And I played it, and... So, I know a lot of people are gonna get mad at me for this opinion, but it is genuinely how I feel. I can only give this 3 stars out of 5. The summary is full marks for inventiveness, but to me, this game is a little too experimental, and not all of its ideas stick the landing. And it tries to do so much, it suffers from heavy tonal whiplash at times. The premise of Live Alive is it's split into multiple short RPGs, each based on a different time period, and each riffing on classic story tropes of that time period. All of these are loving tributes to the classics. But because this was a 90s game, mostly 80s and before classics. For example, the Far Future chapter is almost a direct unofficial remake of Alien. Don't get me wrong though, these may be cliches, but they're very well written cliches, and in the remake, very well acted. The English dub even gets voice actors of the appropriate ethnicity for each time period. For example, the Imperial China chapter has an all-Chinese cast. Each of these chapters is very short, beatable in 1 to 2 hours, but I found myself needing to take long breaks between each one, as they are dense within that runtime, telling a fully complete story with some very heavy emotions, getting downright harrowing at times. Trust me, you will need room to breathe after these are done. That all sounds great, right? So where are my issues? Firstly, I didn't find the core RPG combat system that ties all the chapters together that engaging. You battle on a grid, and every step you take on that grid advances the ATB meters of the enemies. Attacks have different ranges, and there is some advantage to hitting enemies from behind, or using moves that push them to interrupt their charge skills. I've heard the remake improves the battle system significantly by actually showing the ATB meters of you and the enemies. That, attack elements, attack secondary effects, and enemy weaknesses and resistances were all off-screen in the original, and I can see that being a pain. But with a few exceptions, I never enjoyed battles that much. And again, this is the one mechanic that ties everything together, and without it, here's where I get into the whole tonal whiplash. The best way I can describe this is I'll go through my thoughts on each chapter in chronological order, because each one has a significant pro and a significant con to me, and they're all wildly different. Firstly, the one I started with, Prehistory. This is the most standard RPG-like of the chapters, so it's often recommended as a starting point. And I love the idea of trying to tell a story with no words, just gestures and emoticons. The cons? This chapter is very heavy on physical comedy, poop and fart jokes. It's not something that I expect when playing a JRPG, and it felt so jarring, I was almost turned off the game entirely, until people told me the other chapters weren't like that. Imperial China is probably my favourite of all the chapters, having the almost perfect balance of story and gameplay. It also has a really cool twist where your playstyle ends up shaping the story. For cons, this is the one chapter I'd argue is a little too long, and it ends in a long dungeon with a lot of forced fights. Twilight of Edo Japan is maybe the most ambitious chapter in the game, and that's really saying something. It's practically a sandbox where you have a lot of different ways to approach obstacles and enemies, and its ending changing based on how many enemies you killed or spared directly inspired Undertale. The problem is that a full pacifist or full murder route are impossible without following a guide. Also, the pacifist reward is immediately outclassed in the final chapter. The Wild West absolutely nails its theme, especially in the remake's voice acting. I know it's hyperbole, but Reagan Murdoch needs to voice every cowboy hero from now on. But this chapter is also painfully short. You barely get a chance to see the Sundown Kid's gameplay, because there's only like 3 fights. One of them is the chapter's main boss, and the other 2 are against the same guy and are pathetic. The Present Day, aka Martial Arts chapter, is another candidate for my favorite chapter in the game. The premise is essentially Street Fighter 2 as an RPG, but mixed with a bit of Mega Man, since the protagonist copies moves from his defeated opponents, and certain moves make some of the other fighters easier to beat. What's really cool about this is the main character doesn't even level up in this chapter. The progression is entirely from learning new moves and figuring out how to best use them. I can't think of many downsides for this chapter. The near future is a chapter many people hate, but apparently the remake improves a lot of the obtuse event flags in the original. Apparently its protagonist was also terrible in the SNES version and he got buffed heavily in the remake. But overall, I did enjoy this chapter a lot more than I thought I would, and its story genuinely surprised me at points, though I'm admittedly not as familiar with the 80s manga and anime it's referencing, compared to the other genres in this game. For cons though, this chapter does have a lot of running back and forth just to hit event flags and do sort of fetch quests, and also there's an entire item crafting mechanic that I never once engaged with, and only after beating the game did I find out you can transfer some of these items to the final chapter. The far future, it's hot take time. To many people, this is the peak of this game. To me though, this chapter is basically a pure horror visual novel with almost no gameplay. And to me, its plot wasn't that special, because I've seen films like Alien and 2001: A Space Odyssey. I will admit bias here though, as I'm not a fan of horror adventure games where the only way to die is instant kill traps. I will say though, Cube is best robot must protect. I chose them as my final chapter protagonist, which says something. Then there's a secret chapter that you unlock after completing all of the main ones, and I refuse to say anything about this one other than it is amazing. Play it or at least experience it for yourself. This chapter alone may have made the rest of this game worth it for me. But then there's the final chapter. The final chapter alone takes up maybe half the playtime of the game, and it does overstay its welcome in my view. The final battle and ending are good though. Overall, Live Alive was a strange experience for me. It's something I'm very glad that I experienced, because I think this is an incredible work of art, but it's not always a great video game. There were many times when I felt like I was forcing myself through this game, rather than playing it because I wanted to have fun. Lately I've played the demo of Octopath Traveler 2, and I feel like that's a better translation of this same concept. It's still multiple protagonists all with their own stories, but in one world, thereby keeping the tone consistent, and a much more fun battle system tying it all together. I might play that game someday. And now a game I started later but finished earlier, Master Detective Archive's Rain Code. A new IP and spiritual successor to Danganronpa by that series' creator. And I first have to stress, I've never been a big fan of Danganronpa. I just played this game because I was craving a murder mystery and there've been no new Ace Attorneys for years. And the Nintendo Direct trailer for it looked pretty good. I ultimately give this game a 3.5 out of 5, but it was still an enjoyable experience overall. Now, being a murder mystery, I'm gonna give the vaguest possible impressions on this game, because spoiling any of it would completely ruin the experience. Raincoat can be summed up as Danganronpa, but with actual detectives instead of high school students. The presentation of this is actually pretty phenomenal though. Instead of doing your exploring and investigating on static 2D backgrounds, you traverse fully modeled 3D locations. Think of this as a visual novel in the engine of a modern RPG. There are even NPCs to speak to and side quests to complete. In both its layout and its amazing neon cyberpunk art style, Kanai Ward felt like an actual place and was a joy to explore despite it being a brutal dystopia. The other half of the gameplay is the Mystery Labyrinth, and trailers gave it the impression of a dungeon crawling RPG but with detectives. It's really not that, it's just a Danganronpa trial with a flashy coat of paint. Not that that's a bad thing, I just want to set expectations straight. The game does a decent job of making every Mystery Labyrinth feel unique though, and the minigames within them are decently varied and fun. The one exception being, of course, the obligatory Hangman's Gambit counterpart. Why do they keep making these? All of my game overs were in this minigame. Everywhere else, my health never came close to emptying. The characters are very good, well written, and well acted for the most part. Yuma is a decent protagonist. The detective partners you get for all the cases are great, with one exception. There's some pretty good side characters, several good villains, and the main partner character, Shinigami, is okay. She's way less annoying than the trailers made her seem, and she does have some funny moments, and a bit of character growth, though it doesn't come until very late in the story. By the end, Shinigami was far from my favourite character, but I never found her offensively terrible either. She does feel like she mainly exists so people can draw lewd fan art though. The mysteries themselves are decent. None of them are particularly complicated, but there are a few clever tricks and twists. And the Mystery Labyrinth giving culprits JRPG boss-style transformations is a really creative touch. The reason why I only give this game a 3.5 out of 5 is most cases had at least one glaring flaw that prevented them from being truly amazing. One of the exceptions was oddly the prologue case, Chapter 0. This game opens very strong because the first case is brilliant. Unfortunately, that gives Chapters 1, 2, and 3 a little bit of peaked too early syndrome. Chapter 4 was the only one that matched Chapter 0 in my mind, and the final chapter... okay. The following section will contain some more spoilery things, nothing as drastic as me telling you the culprits or the solutions, but if you want to go into the game completely blind, I suggest skipping to the timestamp on screen. So there's one major aspect of Danganronpa that was a deal breaker to me, and the major reason I don't like it as much as Ace Attorney. I was afraid it would be in this game too, and it kind of is. Completing the Mystery Labyrinth kills the culprit. This didn't bother me as much as Danganronpa, because unlike there, they don't make a spectacle of the culprit's death. But as someone who lives in a country, Australia by the way, that abolished the death penalty a long time ago, it still doesn't sit well with me morally, and it robs some of the satisfaction from solving a case. They try to address the morality of this in the story, but it's hard to do so when Shinigami is the only character who truly understands what happened, and she isn't exactly on the same moral wavelength as humanity. As a result, most cases end with Yuma angsting about the culprit's death, and another character assuring him, "Don't worry, I know you did the right thing," despite them not having context on what he actually did. It feels a little hollow. Then we have Chapter 1, which after the incredible Chapter 0, does something very strange. The case's suspects only get one short scene to establish themselves as characters before the mystery labyrinth, and none of them even have names, making it hard to get invested in the reveal of the culprit as you barely know any of these people. And then there's the final chapter, which, being as vague as possible, suffers from the same problem most Danganronpa finales do. It's more concerned with expositing shocking truths about the setting than actually giving you a mystery to solve. And the labyrinth mostly consists of questions you already know the answer to. But overall, this was a very enjoyable game, and I'd love to see it become a full series. The title implies that there could be other Master Detective archives, maybe even with different protagonists, in the future, and the ending clearly leaves that option open too. The next game I beat was a game on Nintendo Switch Online, Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy. This is a game that many friends at my elementary school played while I was growing up. I distinctly remember the infamous Boom Boom Self-Destruct deck being the talk of the playground, but I never got to play it, until now. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and the only reason I docked it 1 is because it's not much more than a card game simulator, but for what it is, it's fun. A warning going in. This game has a tutorial, but it's not very in-depth, and if you do plan on playing it, I highly recommend finding a copy of the Pokemon Gen 1 trading card games rulebook. You can probably get a PDF online. While I never played the Gen 1 rule set as a kid, I did spend my entire childhood absolutely devouring the rulebooks I got in all the theme deck boxes, and the rules have lived rent-free in my brain ever since. Just like the video games, well, this is technically a video game, but you get the idea, the Pokemon card game is simple to learn, but very difficult to actually play well. This game covers the first 3 expansions of the card game, Base Set, Jungle, and Fossil. I also had an advantage here because I collected all those cards as a kid, so most of the card text and rulings are familiar to me. But the text, art, and rules are reproduced in-game. Another tip I have, press the select button a lot. It gives you the best UI and the best view of the playfield. The game itself plays like the Generation 1 Pokemon games, but with somehow even less story. Instead of choosing a starter, you pick a Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle-themed deck, and then make your way across the world challenging the gym leaders, Club Masters, so that you can fight the Elite Grandmasters, and prove that you're a master of children's card games. Hence what I named the protagonist. Instead of leveling up, every opponent you defeat rewards you with 2 to 3 booster packs you can use to modify your deck. The lack of a leveling system means this is truly the challenge the gyms in any order Pokemon game you've always wanted, without the awkward level curve of Scarlet and Violet. And while you can technically fight opponents over and over to grind booster packs, I like to see how far I could get just battling everyone once. By the end of the game, I had a pretty solid deck going, focusing on Rapidash being a Stage 2 Pokemon that was fairly easy to build up and had free retreat, with some basic fighting types on the side because I happened to get Hitmonchan in my first ever booster pack. And I'd heard of the infamous Haymaker decks. Speaking of infamous, the Gen 1 rules have some horrendously broken trainer cards. Later generations introduced the supporter rule for a reason, but here, you can play as many Professor Oaks or Bills as you want per turn. Honestly though, I'm okay with this. Opponents can use these cards too, so there's an even playing field, and it simplifies deck building because every deck wants to run a lot of copies of these trainers. There's also Busted Search in Computer Search, and the disgustingly broken energy removal cards. To give you an idea of how broken, the Gym series would later introduce this card. That should tell you something. There is technically a little bit of side content. You can go for collecting all the cards, there are some optional trades to do, and the infamous Imakuni. Now, this being a trading card game, you might think that battles are very RNG dependent, but I feel like once you've got enough draw power and searching trainer cards, you pretty much make your own luck. Sadly, the same can't be said for your opponents. Their AI is dumb as bricks, but I at least give them credit for actually attempting some interesting strategies, such as Invisible Wall Stall. You will learn to hate Mr. Mime by the end of this game, rushing stage 2s out with Pokemon Breeder, and some decks even use something very close to the classic Rain Dance or Haymaker. The problem I found is that it can be very inconsistent which battles end up being a challenge, because you could end up fighting a major late game boss only for them to get unlucky and brick their deck in the first turn and become a pushover. As in, only drew one basic Pokemon and no energy cards all game levels a pushover. I've seen that happen to the Grandmasters, and it's sad. Although I do like that most battles are only for 4 prize cards, meaning they rarely overstay their welcome. Apparently this version of the game has online multiplayer, and even though the meta is incredibly broken, this does sound genuinely fun if you can get some friends together. So overall, I really enjoy this game, very glad I got to play it. And speaking of Holy Grail unlocalized games, I've heard the Japan-only sequel is even better. And now, the big one.
Come, show me the strength of a demon.
This year, I finally played and beat Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne's HD remaster. I give this one 5 stars, and my review of it actually went mildly viral on Backlogged for some reason. I guess people like it when you praise Nocturne, but here's the thing. I wasn't expecting to. Up till now, I've only experienced Nocturne through YouTube videos of challenge runs and the boss fights. Actually playing it for myself, I realized there's so much more to this game that those videos don't show, and that it's remarkably more respectful of the player than you might think. Yes, this game is not afraid to brutally murder you. Yes, you can die in the tutorial. But did you know there's a free heal point in the tutorial? In fact, all the heal points are free until you get out of the first dungeon. Save points are reasonably placed and fairly frequent, so even though I died a lot, it was rarely frustrating because it rarely cost me much progress. The dungeons are also fairly short and tightly designed. And there are plenty of NPCs to talk to in the world that not only explain game mechanics like fusion and the press turn system, but also give you guidance on where to go next for the story. And this game did wonders for the Shin Megami Tensei formula, not just by introducing the press turn system, but also by getting rid of a lot of annoying mechanics like Magnetite, which it says something that most modern fans don't remember that existing. Essentially, it used to cost a resource just to keep a demon in your party. All of that's gone now. The press turn system is where it's at though, and Nocturne deserves all the credit for introducing this. The premise is, you start with 1 turn per active party member, but if you hit an enemy's weakness or get a critical hit, that turn turns into a blinking half turn and can be used again. But if you miss an attack or an enemy blocks one of your elements, you lose turns. And the same rules apply to both sides. Getting extra turns is always fun in any turn-based system, and this incentivizes to both exploit your enemy's weaknesses and cover your own, along with using buffs or debuffs, which, as the memes will tell you, are very important in this game. Though one of my major gripes is, evasion and accuracy buffs are maybe a little too important. As the Matador boss fight will happily show you, because missing costs the attacker 2 press turns, skills like Sukukaja, Sukunda, and especially Fog Breath, which can be obtained very early, are very broken in the hands of the player. In fact, if you go into a boss fight completely unprepared, you will probably still win as long as you spam accuracy and evasion buffs and debuffs. It wasn't until the final dungeon that I encountered enemies who could reasonably hit me with these buffs up, or actually tried to dispel them. But it also kind of plays into something I love about this game's battle system. Strategy and movesets matter a lot more than levels and raw stats. In fact, the cap for most stats is only 30. Similar to Fire Emblem, I like this because it makes it very clear at a glance what every unit is good and bad at. The party you'll be dealing with consists of the Demi-Fiend and his demon allies. The Demi-Fiend himself is a mixed bag. Every time he levels up, you get to allocate his stat points, meaning min-maxing is possible, but I have seen several viable builds. Even though most people go physical for endgame, going all in on magic early also has its benefits, since it's possible to obtain very strong magical skills from some early Magatama. What are Magatama? They both control the Demi-Fiend's elemental affinities, as well as some of their stats and what skills they learn. And here's where I have a slight problem. You see, every Magatama has around 4 to 6 skills that you learn off of it, but you can only see the next one. And every time you learn a skill, you only have 2 choices. Learn it immediately, or give up on it forever. Unless you have a guide and plan things out carefully, you might end up missing out on skills you later want. Or give up on a Magatama with a great late skill too soon because its early skills didn't look appealing. I prefer the skill customization mechanics in Digital Devil Saga and Shin Megami Tensei 5, where, through some method or another, it's always possible to relearn skills you've given up. The demons themselves need to be obtained via either fusion, which should be familiar to you if you've played Persona. The main difference is the Magatama and element mechanics, which let you upgrade or downgrade a demon within its own class, or fuse extra stats and skills onto a demon without turning them into a new one. But the other way you'll get demons is via negotiation, and this is one of the most controversial elements of this game. You basically answer a bunch of random dialogue trees and throw a bunch of money and items at the demon, hoping the RNG cooperates and they decide to join. While it is very random, I found that you will always recruit the demons you want by sheer persistence eventually, and the money and items asked for in negotiation are rarely too valuable and aren't hard to come by. Some demons have negotiation-specific skills that make it easier, but I rarely even needed them. What might not be familiar to Persona fans is that some demons can evolve Pokemon style. But other than the starting Pixie, most of these aren't obvious without a guide. If you do know about them, they can be very useful. While there are random encounters in most locations, the HUD gives you a clear warning when they're coming, so you can take time to heal yourself and prepare. Speaking of which, my top tip to Nocturne newcomers: fuse a demon with mana refill and a multi-target healing move. As long as you keep them in your main party of 4, they will always have enough MP to top off your health after every encounter. So overall, I had a blast with Nocturne's gameplay, but what about the other aspects? Well, the story, I fully admit, is not my thing, but I also fully admit is well executed for what it is, so I can't really knock the game for it. The game is less focused on story and more on atmosphere and lore. The main characters don't get much screen time and are all varying shades of unlikable, but that's kind of the point. Nocturne really nails the feeling of being hopelessly alone in a world where everything wants you dead. But everything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and stronger, and stronger, until you're the one the demon should be afraid of. The Vortex world and most of its dungeons have atmospheres unlike any other JRPG, not even other Shin Megami Tensei games. And one thing I will praise this for is the 3 reasons, even though most sane people wouldn't want to side with them, are at least an attempt to do something different from the typical lore and chaos. Shijima is kind of similar to lore ideologically, but it's supported by the fallen angels. Because in a world of silence and total conformity, everybody is equal to God. Yosuga has the might makes right ideology of chaos, but it's the side the angels are on. And Musubi's focus on the individual and rejection of all outside forces, but in practice is more like a far more cynical version of Maruki's reality in Persona 5. With everyone confined to their own personalized perfect world. There are two other options, but neither ending is exactly perfect. But here's where I take some issue with the story's presentation. In the vanilla release of the game, those were the only 5 endings available. Then Maniacs came out, which is the only version Westerners originally received. Maniacs added the Labyrinth of Amala and the commonly misquoted as True Demon ending. Its actual name is something else that's a spoiler. But essentially, this added ending not only is way more classic SMT tinted, it also has additional content, making it feel like the true canon ending, and retroactively making all the others pointless. Even the lore revealed in the Labyrinth of Amala seems to be telling the player nothing that happens in this world matters. Again, not exactly badly written or executed, but it's really not my kind of story. That was depressing, but ultimately, I had a blast with Nocturne's gameplay. And I recommend anybody who started with Persona play this game someday. Maybe not as your first SMT game though. I'd recommend Shin Megami Tensei 4, 5, or Digital Devil Saga for that. They're all great games too, but much more accessible and less difficult. And combining accessible and difficult, see that segue, is Super Mario Bros. Wonder. This section's gonna be weird because I think this game is phenomenal, easily the best 2D Mario platformer I've ever played, but there's not much I can really say about it besides it's good, and I don't want to spoil the levels because they're best experience for yourself. I'll just say that Super Mario Bros. Wonder manages to be a truly inventive Mario platformer. Every individual level feels unique, establishing a new gameplay gimmick, building on it, and bringing it to a big conclusion with the Wonder effect. These levels are also populated with an amazing cast of colourful original Mario enemies. Imagine that! Please take notes, future Paper Mario. Not only do they have very creative and fun designs, they all have a clear gameplay gimmick, and often entire stages are built around them. There's also a vast array of playable characters, and while they're all identical, switching between them helps the gameplay feel fresh and adds more variety to multiplayer mode. The new power-ups, the Elephant, Bubble Flower, and Drill are all amazing and used in great ways throughout the levels. There's a bit of non-linearity in how you take on levels and sometimes whole worlds. Each level gets a difficulty rating from 1 to 5 stars, and there are 4-star levels even in the first world. The challenge is there if you want it from the beginning, but skippable if you don't. My only real gripes are, there's not a lot of variety in boss fights, and some worlds don't even have a boss. And the special world levels are weirdly ordered. These are brutal optional challenges you unlock for completing the other worlds. And weirdly, World 2's special world level is maybe the hardest level in the entire game, even including the final special world stage. Climb to the Beat nearly gave me an actual heart attack the first time I played it. I had to take a week-long break from the game for the sake of my health. And strangely, none of the other special world levels gave me that much trouble. Maybe this one should have been placed later in the game. My only other nitpick, the final boss is really easy. But, yeah, that's all I have to say. Super Mario Wonder, great game. Shocking, I know. Next game I finished was Final Fantasy IV DS. A game I've wanted to play for years, but I finally got my hands on a copy in a retro game store. There were times my enjoyment was hampered by frustration at the difficulty, but that's more a me issue than the game. I'll get to the difficulty issue later, but first, Final Fantasy IV is a game that really set the template for not only modern Final Fantasy, but also modern JRPGs in general. While it definitely wasn't the first to have a developed story and party members with actual character arcs, but it was one of the most popular and likely influential. The character arcs are basic by modern standards, but very impressive for their time. Especially Cecil, an early example of a character with a dark, troubled past undergoing a redemption arc. And the game did something great here I don't often see in modern takes on this archetype. You actually visit a town that the protagonist helped invade in the past, and witness firsthand the sheer hatred the people there have for you. And I mean that in a gameplay sense too. You can't do the normal RPG behavior of talking to every NPC. The shop and innkeepers will take advantage of you, and some of the NPCs will cast status spells on you. Rarely in a video game do you get to see the consequences of someone's past in such a tangible way. Gameplay-wise, this was the first Final Fantasy to use the active time battle system, where you wait for a meter to fill up before you take your turn. And overall it works pretty well, and the first boss is an excellent tutorial on the mechanic, becoming invulnerable in mist form until you wait in real time for it to change back. Again, this has all been refined and done better in later examples of the genre, but it's good to go back and see where all this started, and honestly, it holds up incredibly well. Even its graphical style, I've always found this kind of DS 3D charming. Another thing in Final Fantasy IV that I miss in modern RPGs is quality over quantity in side quests. There's only maybe like 12 concrete side quests in this game, but all of them take you to a new location, usually have a new boss, and reward you with an amazing new ability for a party member or closure on a plot point that is glossed over in the main story. Less get me 20 wolf pelts and more of this in modern RPGs, please. One aspect where I feel this hasn't aged as well though is the party system. There didn't seem to be a way to swap people in and out of an active party, which means the game handles this by giving you a constant revolving door of guest characters until it finally settles on a party of 5. The problem I have with this is some of the guest characters are developed enough that I wish they stuck around. Meanwhile, one of the people who ends up in the final party, I felt was irrelevant to the main plot and should have been a temporary one. Apparently the GBA version fixes this and does let you use all the party members throughout the game. Strange the DS version doesn't. And speaking of issues with the DS version, back to the difficulty. This is the hardest version of Final Fantasy IV by far, and might not have been the best one to start with for me. There are points where the game completely kicked my butt, but often I was able to come back with a new strategy and win in a very satisfying way. In this game, buffs and debuffs actually matter, and my biggest advice is slow is your friend. It works on almost every boss. However, some enemies in the final dungeon I felt were downright unfair, red dragons, and I'd run from them on principle. Another negative of the DS version is the augment system. These are items you can use to teach party members new skills, acting as a bit of customization as there's no real job system here. And this is all well and good until you realise that all the best augments, such as double cast, are locked behind giving multiple augments to guest characters before they leave, and nothing tells you this unless you have a guide. And this would be fine if these were just a bonus, but in a game this hard, you need these good skills, especially if you're new to the game. And so you're almost forced to follow a guide as to which skills you want to save and which are expendable enough to give to guests, and if you miss too many optional augments you might not have enough to secure crucial later ones. They were probably trying to make sure you weren't punished for giving skills to temporary characters, but they went a bit too far. Overall, despite some issues, I love this game, and I can see why it's a favourite among longtime Final Fantasy fans. I wanted to play Ratchet & Clank on PC this year, but it was crazily expensive. I waited for the Steam Black Friday sale, and bought Hi-Fi Rush instead because it was way cheaper and I felt I get the same amount of enjoyment from it. Hi-Fi Rush is a game from a Bethesda affiliate that appears to be a Western-Japanese co-production that the developers shadow-dropped, trusting good word of mouth to sell it, and if you know how much of a buzz this game had earlier in the year, you can tell they were successful. It's basically a rhythm action game with light platformer elements, but if you're interested in what the game is like, I highly recommend checking out a video of the first level. It does a great job of telling you what you're in for and selling you on the premise. The combat is, in my opinion, vastly better than the platforming, but I came to enjoy the platforming sections as breathers between fights because the combat is also surprisingly complex. The first stage alone introduces light and heavy attacks, combining those to use different types of combos, each of which has a different AoE, super moves, collectathon items that increase your health and super meter, dodging, rhythmic combo finishes called beat hits, rest combos, and a scoring system. Then you get a shop that lets you buy different combos that require different combinations of light and heavy attacks, a grappling hook, a parry system, partner assists, multiple partners whose assists all do different things, partner assist combos. So first you have to memorize the button combos for each of these, then you need to figure out which of them is tactically the most advantageous in each combat situation, and then you have to do all of that in time with the rhythm. I fully admit, at high levels of play, this game looks amazing. Someone like me though, I can really only do one of those three things very well. I can do two of them at the same time suboptimally, but make me do all three and my brain melts. Admittedly, the game doesn't expect you to master this in order to just beat the game. But the post-game, which I was able to beat, does demand significantly more from you, and I've already resigned myself to the fact that I'm never getting all the achievements. But don't let my skill issues dissuade you. This is a very fun game, and fun sums up the story and characters too. It's a perfect example of why simple can still be good, as the core plot is just, an evil corporation wants to kill you, fight them. But the executives of this corporation are all incredible villains with spectacular boss fights, and the main cast of characters are really fun too. Chai is voiced by Robbie Daymond, and as always, he's amazing, but the rest of Chai's team are also good, though I don't actually like Cinnamon all that much. He does one cool thing in the story, but other than that, he's mostly filler and comic relief in a game where every character is funny, so you don't really need that. My only other issue with the story is the villains all casually explode and die after you beat them, and none of the characters bat an eyelid at this, which feels very jarring with the otherwise cartoonish art style and tone. I've heard the tone was inspired by Edgar Wright movies, but even Scott Pilgrim implied that the evil X's respawn unharmed after their defeats. Anyway, Hi-Fi Rush, really fun game I'll never be an expert at. Last game of the year I beat was Persona 5 Tactica, and I'm gonna be brief here, but I sum up this game as surprising. I was hoping for good things, but it was a lot better than I expected. The gameplay loop with one Moors is really fun, and despite being very easy, this didn't detract from the fun. It was addictive finding the most efficient way to use one Moors to move through the map. And despite a lack of unique enemy types, the maps themselves are quite varied in the challenges they provide. The story is also surprisingly good, though it's not really about the Phantom Thieves as individuals. It's weird. The Phantom Thieves as a conceptual whole are very relevant to Toshiro's issues, but as individual people, they're pretty much replaceable, and I get this could be a deal breaker for some. That said, Haru and Futaba, surprisingly, get some really nice story moments, as they're the ones who can relate most to Toshiro's issues. Even Ryuji gets a couple of good moments. Though, as a Makoto fan, this game is not a good showing from her. But her treatment is not quite as bad as Akihiko and Chie in Persona 3 and 4 spin-offs, which is something. But Toshiro and Irina are great characters and very different from the new characters in Strikers. I can't describe why without spoiling everything, but trust me, they're great. So that's 3 for 3 for strategy games that unexpectedly blew me away this year. To finish, because Backlogged has a Game of the Year feature, I thought I'd go through mine. So firstly, best gameplay, well, I'm sure you all know what I'm choosing for this one. Best narrative is kind of weird. If I had to pick out of the games I played this year, this counts because the deluxe edition was released in 2023. The problem is that this narrative is from 2011. If I had to pick out of 2023 games, the winner would probably be either Future Redeemed or Persona 5 Tactica, but more by default than anything else. I didn't play a lot of games with truly spectacular stories this year. Best art direction? This one's interesting. I'm going to actually give this to Raincode. I love the neon cyberpunk look of this game. It makes me want to actually live in Kanai Ward, despite it being a horrible dystopia. Best soundtrack? This is going to Reboot Camp. I keep saying this, but I'll say it again. Way Forward did not need to go this hard. Finally, I guess Mario Wonder gets best multiplayer by default, even though I never played it. Yeah. But finally, Game of the Year, this should surprise absolutely nobody, it's going to be Fire Emblem Engage for me. And you already know the reasons why. So, those are my picks for Best of 2023 out of just what I played. What are all your thoughts on the games you played this year? I've really enjoyed 2023 on the channel, and I'll look forward to more big things from me next year. Until then, see you.